Good afternoon and thank you. My name is Jana Peel and it's such a delight to see such a wonderful group gathered here for the Swire Properties Group Art Talk. Andy Warhol said good business is the best art. And today what we're here to talk about is the artful business of fundraising and friend-raising for the sustainability of public arts institutions. Sometimes they're even the same thing, as you can imagine. 8 months ago, I moved from Hong Kong, my beloved arts community, to London. And on the request of our chairman, Michael Bloomberg, I was asked to move from my board seat to the hot seat as CEO of the Serpentine Galleries in Kensington Gardens. When I arrived in this amazing 50-year-old institution and the word CEO started to become known among my colleagues, I had to convince them that that could only stand for Chief Eternal Optimist. And I really think you have to be in the public arts in Britain today. And for all of us, I think optimism, amazing ideas are what really drive the initiative, the funds, the friends, and the arts. I'm incredibly optimistic about our open landscape in Kensington Gardens, an open landscape for art and ideas that bridges two sites in multiple worlds. And as we enter our 50th year, I look at the 1.5 million people that come through the doorstep for free, and I realize that this business is pretty expensive. So, with that in mind, I'm excited to be here with these esteemed colleagues and experts to hear from them about their incredible individual experiences, from which I look forward to taking a page or two, and I know that you do as well. Very, very briefly, in terms of my own experience in the arts, it's really been around culture and commerce. It's a really interesting question that framed this talk that was put to us by Patricia, by Lavina. Hong Kong has seen the rapid development of the arts and culture supported by institutional infrastructure spending, but the costs of running arts organizations and the daily production of art has outpaced any increases in public funding. Individual artists and arts organizations have had to focus on raising private funds to meet their needs and sustain their growth. Are other alternatives available? Well, I think other alternatives are not only available, but they are vital. And I'm sure that's our experience, whether it's in Marfa, Texas, whether it's in Beijing, in Oxford, in Hong Kong, or around the world. In conclusion, for us, the proof is here very much with the Swire collaboration. The Serpentine has come here in partnership with Swire to put on an incredible exhibition of Zaha Hadid's paintings and drawings, which I hope you'll have the opportunity to see. It's an incredible homage and tribute to our absent friend, which wouldn't have happened without the kind of creative collaborations which we'll learn more about today. Now over to my very, very esteemed panelists who share a very common passion for bringing public art to the widest audiences, but have very different experiences and paths that have brought them there. First, of course, I have Chung Leung. He is the executive director of the charities and community at the Hong Kong Jockey Club since 2014. The Hong Kong Jockey Club, as some of you know, donates close to 4 billion Hong Kong dollars to the community annually, is that right? Through the Charities Trust for the betterment of Hong Kong. And a friend of mine the other day told me that that actually puts the Jockey Club as one of the top 10 donors in the world, along with the Gates Foundation and other names known. So I think, not known to the rest of the world, but I think we have to celebrate that kind of commitment. We will also soon clap about Jenny Moore, of course, because she is the director of the Chinati Foundation, who has made her way to Art Basel in its 10th year, all the way from Marfa, Texas. Jenny is doing incredible work, as she'll tell you about, in Marfa, but was also previously associate curator at the New Museum in New York City, so she has extensive experience from New York, the epicenter of fundraising, which she can share. And last but not least, a man who needs very, very little introduction in this part of the world, Phil Tanari. Phil is, of course, the director of the Uhlans Center of Contemporary Art, the UCCA, at the heart of Beijing's 798 district, where he has served in that leading role since 2011. He's also currently, in all his spare time, a DPhil, a candidate in art history at Oxford, and co-curator with Alexandra Monroe of the exhibition Art in China After 1989, Theater of the World, which we all look forward to seeing at the Solomon R. Guggenheim Museum in October 2017. And so on that note, I would love to ask Leung about this incredible model, which seems to have gone from yes to easy in 100 years of giving. can you share some experiences around the Hong Kong Jockey Club and its incredible work?
Sure. Thank you, Yana. If you don't mind, I have prepared just 5 slides to share. So this one doesn't count. So it's a rather unique business model. I think for people from Hong Kong, you probably know it quite well. The Jockey Club, the Hong Kong Jockey Club, is a sort of a business without shareholders. So we're overall a not-for-profit business model. So we basically channel the world-class racing and then sort of the wagering side of the things and then into charities and communities and also tax for Hong Kong community. So we pay last year about 21 billion Hong Kong dollar worth of taxes. So we're the single largest taxpayer in Hong Kong. And then over and beyond that, through the Charities Trust, we also donate roughly about 3.9 billion Hong Kong dollar to various community causes. So that's the business model. Some very significant projects, and you can also see roughly the evolution of how sort of the Charities Trust evolve. So back in the 50s and 60s, we see a lot of community infrastructures. So we donated substantially to clinics, to swimming pools, and then in the 70s to build the ocean park for Hong Kong. So a lot of them very infrastructural to, in a way, meet the need of the time. But then gradually going into the 90s and the 2000s, we also started to help substantially build sort of infrastructures in higher education. So for example, in early 90s, we donated to build the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology, which was at that time the 3rd university in Hong Kong. We also helped build the Hong Kong Academy for Performing Arts. So again, that probably much more related to today's topic. We help, infrastructure and pipeline building, if you will, for the industry. And of course, later on, I would spend a little bit more time on Dai Guan, so the Central Police Station revitalization project. Very challenging project overall, but I can share a little bit more when we go to that. So just some projects. And thank you also for Yana's introduction. We actually started our first donation back in 1915, so about 100 years ago. And it's taken a long way for us to come to where we are today. So today we rank roughly top 10, being the only Asian non-government foundation ranking in the top 10 foundations of the world. So this is how we think about sort of art, culture, and heritage at the foundation. So Yana, was introducing us sort of from yes to easy. So a little bit of background even before that is the foundation. We obviously, given the size, we support many different themes. So from youth to elderly to sports to medical and health, family, you name it. So art, culture, and heritage is one of the areas that we focus on. So yes was basically youth, elderly, and sports. So that has been our strategy in the last about 3 years. Recently, our board decided to also add arts and culture and heritage into that strategic focus. So adding an A into yes, some of my very smart colleagues changed that to easy. So that's how easy comes. And then when it comes to arts, culture, and heritage, the way we think about it is really 4 buckets. So on infrastructure, what can we support in terms of infrastructure? Now, the example I gave would be sort of Dai Guan, would be the Academy for Performing Arts and whatnot. But then we also think about audience and talent and then programs. We probably don't need to go through all of those in details, but I think one very core theme from us is that we don't want to be bound by one specific form of art. So we can go across different art. And secondly, very importantly, being a charities trust, we always want to think what can help us promote social inclusion. So when we think about sports, it's not elite sports. It's sports for everyone. It's also using sports to help the disadvantaged, to build our confidence, or help the physically challenged or mentally challenged people to be more involved. Similarly, when we think about arts, culture, and heritage, we also try to think through, in those angles, how we can use art in hospitals to help maybe end-of-life patient to have a more calmful, peaceful sort of end journey. How we can use art to help build maybe ethnic minorities' confidence in certain schools. For example, in November, we'll be working with the Arts Festival to bring Gustavo Dudamel, El Sistema, to Hong Kong. So in addition to supporting the performance, which will be a 5 days Beethoven marathon, but also we help really to put together forums and education panels to then have El Sistema talking to the local art groups on how the local art groups could potentially leverage an idea like that to help the underprivileged people in Hong Kong. So I think just want to emphasize, in a way, this is very much what the Charities Trust is all about. So we want to go beyond just appreciation, but also using art to promote social inclusion. And very quickly on Dai Gun, so this is a, some of you may have been to the site. It's still officially not open yet, so we're hoping to get it open as soon as possible, whenever we're ready. But it's a site with 18 buildings, so 16 of them heritage buildings, and 2 of them new buildings by Herzog de Meuron. So basically on the site will be elements, some commercial elements where you have food and beverages. That's about 27% of the gross area. And the remaining areas will be devoted to heritage, most importantly, and through heritage also education to our community. And then also contemporary art. So there will be a gallery space, about 1,500 meters square, which is obviously nothing compared to M+. M+ is like 20,000 meters square. So very different in positioning in that sense. But it's a very unique location. It's right at the heart of the city. It's in Central. So we like to, Tobias I think is also here. Obviously I'm not an expert, but Tobias is, and a lot of you will know him. So basically, I think in Dai Gun, what we see as a Charities Trust is really that it is one location that potentially could combine all of the things that we like to pursue in the overall arts and culture and heritage strategy. Of course, we will continue to support various groups in Hong Kong to continue to pursue their dreams. We continue to collaborate and partner with people. But this particular site would also kind of combine all elements together. So that's our aspiration in Dai Gun. Perhaps I'll just stop here.
Not at all. I'm just so fascinated by Dai Gun because I had the tremendous pleasure and privilege with 20 of our friends of the Serpentine, with our council, to have an incredible tour from Tobias Berger, who, if you don't know, you need to know urgently ahead of the opening because it's really going to be the most incredible evolution in Hong Kong. And as I looked at that, I remembered where 9 years ago I arrived in Hong Kong, and I became board member and eventually co-chair of the Parasite Art Space. And when we started, it was 90% government funding, and now we're at about 90% private, and grateful for the government, but very independent in terms of our private support. Can we touch a little bit about the ecosystem before we move to Jenny in terms of private-public funding, in terms of how Jockey Club, if we look out 5-10 years, will sit alongside the F&B, the retail, and perhaps potentially, or maybe without any need for private sources of support?
Sure, thank you, Anna. Because you asked this question, so we actually have prepared some numbers. So from what we understand, by sort of say 2016-17, the government budget overall on art, culture, heritage related in Hong Kong is about 4 billion. But that of course included all the expenses into libraries, public libraries, the LCSD facilities, and all of that. Now, the ADC, Art Development Council, they give out about 500 million a year, so to the 9 selected groups. So that's roughly, if you will, from the official side of the figure. The Jockey Club, if we don't count Dai Gun into the picture, we give out roughly 150, 200 million Hong Kong dollar a year. So nothing close to what the government is giving. But of course, the difference is, government support all of the infrastructure and other things, whereas our 150 and 200, they generally go to programs. Various types of programs, whether it's audience building, whether it's talent development, or whether it would be programs, but using arts and culture heritage to promote social inclusion. Dai Hang Mo Fo Long, the fire dragon thing, it's supported by the Jockey Club. Changzhou Chang Bao Shan, it's supported by the Jockey Club. So I think from that sense, we're very much also into the space. But to be absolutely honest, I think the private side or from the corporate side, Swire does a lot. A few other companies, they do a lot. When you sort of open the art festival brochure, you see a lot of people. but nothing very transparent in that sense. So data transparency, at least from our research, is not quite there. So we really don't know, who is doing what, right? Potentially for people who are always in the scene, then some companies or some people would do that consistently and with some sort of budget in mind. Now we do. We don't know whether everyone else does that because the behavior change is significant. If you donate from time to time, as you wish, it's a very different behavior from when you donate annually, having a budget in mind. It's just completely different behavior. So I think maybe that's an interesting angle going forward for discussion, sort of how we can move people.
So we'll have a Q&A at the end, of course, and we look forward to raising this topic. It's interesting on the issue of corporates. When I arrived at the Serpentine, we realized with about 75% dependence on private support, there would really need to be more corporate involvement. And in a very saturated London, we realized that the way to do that was to come up with the most exciting program and communicate it as far ahead as possible. And what I did in our first year with a wonderful team is think about how to align partners, for example, for the Zaha Hadid exhibition, like Swarovski and Swire and Google and HTC, and for an exhibition like Grayson Perry to think about how a British brand like Mulberry could support Grayson and not make him say that compromises my work. So I think as we look ahead, we look at the summer party, which for the first year will be sponsored by Chanel, which is incredibly exciting. And for us, we always find that place where the art is a partner, where it's not just philanthropic or needy, but where there's a win-win situation, where we're really in a great partnership because it's so compatible, in a sense, to find these great partnerships that can align themselves with the most exciting artworks of the day. Speaking of which, Jenny Moore's in a very different, incredibly exciting situation in a singular American artist-founded institution. What I'd love to ask you quickly, because it's a burning question as we look at the American headlines. Around the National Endowment for the Arts, our chairman just said that there's, in terms of the tax structure as well, going to be significant impact on how American nonprofits in the blue states get funded. What does your government support look like, and how might some of these changes affect you top down before we start looking at the amazing work bottom up?
The history of Chinati, we have been able to survive because we've had a kind of a fascinating mix of philanthropic support. It's been very interesting to be here because I'm sort of the American who is being held responsible for our current president. I take no responsibility at all. I'm sorry, I'm embarrassed, I'm mortified, I'm appalled, I'm terrified. It's, I appreciate we can all laugh together, but it's, it is, in all seriousness, what is happening is the attempt to dismantle a lot of things that are significant, essential for our culture, our society, our democracy. The NEA is such a ridiculously, the National Endowment for the Arts and the National Endowment for the Humanities, it's such a ridiculously, also embarrassingly small.
Is that 150 million? Or
I think it's 300 million, but it's been pointed out to me that some security entails for some people's lifestyle is also equal to the portion of what we allocate for funding in the arts. It cuts both ways. The Chinati Foundation, which is a contemporary art museum founded by the artist Donald Judd in Marfa, Texas, we were established with the support of Dia Art Foundation. And Judd left New York. He thought it was kind of a harsh and glib environment for the creation of art, and he went to Marfa, which this, in the foreground, is the Chinati Foundation. We're situated in a former military base. We have 34 buildings and 340 acres, so we're not your typical museum in that respect. In addition to the fact that it was founded by the artist Donald Judd. Behind us, or here, is the teeming metropolis of Marfa, Texas, which is a population of 2,000 people. So there are more people in this building right now, probably, than live in Marfa, Texas. And it takes a solid 12 hours to get from New York City to Marfa. So everyone that finds their way to us is taking a real journey, and that is what Judd was hoping would happen. I mean, he left looking for space. You can see it here. And he created an installation in what had been former military buildings. This is, of course, our iconic 100 works in mill aluminum. He transformed what had been, and the artillery sheds, these buildings buildings house the artillery and mechanized vehicles for the military, into one of the most, if I don't mind saying so myself, extraordinary installations of contemporary art set within this very dynamic landscape and the light of Marfa, Texas. At the time, and still, Marfa is not on the way to anywhere else. So if you're going to come and experience this installation, it's really a commitment to come to this place. But originally, DIA Art Foundation, very much Heiner Friedrich, Philippa de Menil, and Helen Winkler is a very, very important person in that story. They wanted to find a way to support artists in a more traditional model, I guess, of patronage, I would say, and give artists the opportunity to create something that wasn't happening anywhere else. It wasn't happening in the city centers. It wasn't happening in the kind of obvious places for contemporary art. There were a lot of artists who went out into the desert in the 70s to make work. I'm often struck by the generosity of Judd on his own part, in that from the beginning, Chinati was not just about his own work, but the work of other artists. It was originally conceived as supporting Donald Judd's work, Dan Flavin, and John Chamberlain. He thought that was all that could be done well. He didn't think that every institution should be an anthology or have 100 or 1,000 artists in it. But here, he was able to do something in a scale that was not possible. This is an image of his 15 works in concrete. These are massive works. They are 2.5 by 2.5 by 5 meters each section, and they span a kilometer. So here he could work on a scale, and also very important, permanent. All of the installations at Chinati are permanent. He wanted there to be a place where a standard, an ideal was set by the artists themselves, so that somewhere a portion of contemporary art had to exist that set the ideal experience for that artist's work on their terms. It was not driven by institutional interests. It was very much the need of the artist. We've continued that with, I'm very proud to say, we just accomplished this, was a very ambitious project for us. This is an image of Robert Irwin's Untitled Dawn to Dusk. This is a work that was 16 years in the making. In addition to the original 3 artists, Judd had a vision that developed over time. So as other artists came to Marfa upon his invitation, or he found other artists like Ronnie Horn, whose work he very much was inspired by and wanted to support, he invited those artists to consider a work for Chinati.
Jenny, can I interrupt you for one moment? Because the model of funding for this was very innovative. I don't know if that was the $5 million campaign.
Yes.
But I'd love for you to share with the group the funding and how that fit into the broader model.
Right.
Such an ambitious and amazing execution of a long-term vision.
Because Robert Irwin, when he was invited to consider a work for Chinati in 1999, I hope a lot of people know Bob Irwin's work and know his name, but I wouldn't say he's one of the most, I think he's one of the most important and influential American artists, but I can't say he's the most well-known American artist. So this project developed over time when the institution was, I would say, kind of in a survival mode. After DIA initially supported the Chinati Foundation, there was a separation, and we no longer had funding from DIA. So Judd established Chinati as its own nonprofit kind of art museum in 1986. We're celebrating our 30th anniversary. It's a very exciting time for us. But Judd passed away in 1994. So there were these moments where the funding was gone or the artist was no longer with us. So how does an institution like this endure? And I think that we're very fortunate that 30 years in, we are more relevant and resonant now, 30 years in, than we were when Judd established it. I think people are willing to go farther for a meaningful experience with art. I think people are looking for authentic experiences. I think the fact that this was an artist-driven institution is very inspiring for people, and he changed the rules of the game. I mean, he was an artist who didn't think that institutions were supporting artists on the level that they should be supported, so he went to a very far-flung place and created an extraordinary situation. With Robert Irwin, Bob had ideas for what we're looking at as kind of a rebuilt abandoned hospital. It's quite dynamic, as are all the installations there, very much affected by the context of the light and space in Marfa. But there were fits and starts, and for anyone who knows Robert Irwin's work, it's sort of mythological in how many projects were supposed to happen but never did. And so I can just say, working with Bob in just the endless enthusiasm and optimism that these things are important to have in the world. So where there's a will, there's a way, and great art will happen if you can just inspire enough people to be a part of it. So for our model, it was a $5 million campaign. That
How
is
does
an
that fit into your
ambitious-
broader budget? Just
Our
to give us
budget
an
is
idea?
2.4 annually. So
this
it was
double an annual. It's like a capital campaign in
exactly,
itself.
very much so. And we announced that project 6 weeks after I arrived as a director. So it was hitting the ground running in some cases, quite literally. And I think it was an opportunity for us on many levels to. For me to be out there in the world and thanking those that have funded us and supported us, and it's an enormous amount of individual support. I mean, we have been very fortunate to receive funding from the NEA, but it's a very, very, very small portion. They were one of the first or entities to come in and support the Robert Irwin project. So although percentage-wise it was a small percentage, the inspiration of the National Endowment for the Arts that they thought this was a legitimate project goes a long way. I think in our case it's less the monetary value than it is that this is actually culturally significant. And so in 2 years' time, we raised the $5 million. What was new for us, well, a lot of individual support. I think the opportunity for an
Give us
artist...
an idea of what a lot means. So what kind of group of friends came together around that kind of project?
We had some individuals, and I feel that they should be championed. Patrick Lannon and the Lannon Foundation. And I'll back up a minute. You know, we are all here because we believe in great art. And I think one of the most rewarding things, second to the relationship and the work I've been able to do with artists, is the work we do together as colleagues. And Michael Govan, who I know many of you know as the director at LACMA, but when he was at DIA Art Foundation, and creating Dia Beacon, he also very much drove support for Chinati. So the Lannon Foundation came in while they were supporting Dia Beacon, very much sort of implored by Michael that this place needs to exist. And Michael, as the director of another institution, helped us establish an endowment for our institution. And I think, you know, the relationships and the support, I think people sometimes think it must be quite competitive because, you know, there are limited resources and we all have ambitious projects, but I can't say enough how incredible it is to be collaborating and collegiate and supporting each other in these endeavors. And Chinati has very much thrived because other museum directors or other people who fund other institutions recognize the singular nature of this place and feel like certainly there's enough for us to be able to share for it to endure.
I think that's a great point in terms of the amount of resources. They very much are often only limited by the ambitions of the project. And one man who has had no limit to his ambitions, of course, is Phil Tenari. It's interesting, about 12 years ago, I think we met when I was first leaving banking Goldman Sachs to set up a foundation called Outset, which was pioneering at the time in England in terms of really crowdfunding. I know you've worked with Kickstarter, and I'd love to come back to that, but this was a very Luddite kind of Kickstarter. It was museum friend groups, which we had brought over from the US and raised public funds for projects, including 100 gifts to Tate that were made over the years. What Phil's done in recent years is, of course, taken the British model, the American model, and made it even better. And so I'd love to hear what you've done in recent years at UCCA in terms of taking best practice and taking an institution that was also formerly director-led into a new era.
I guess did my images not get loaded? I'm not sure that I sent them. I don't know what happened.
There we are. It's
Oh, there we
perfect
go. Okay,
segue.
perfect. So I wanted to start here and sort of work backwards. And actually, this was a photo that was just taken in October of 2016, including quite a number of members of the UCCA, which is the Olin Center for Contemporary Art, Patrons Council, actually on site in front of Prada Marfa, which if you go there, you'll learn is actually not in Marfa proper. And it's not in walking distance of Marfa.
And it's not a Prada.
And it's actually
60
It's
miles
actually
away.
not a Prada.
so backing it up even further, it's actually a piece by the artist duo Elm Green and Dragset, a Scandinavian, Berlin, London-based team who who actually we made a major exhibition with at UCCA in 2016. And it's an installation that kind of comments on commercialism, takes a little bit of a Juddian sort of minimalist form. Not actually a product of the Chinati Foundation, but I think an epiphenomenon, let's say, of the art scene that grew up in Marfa. And what are we doing there besides feeling rather hungover after a long bonfire on the ranch where Scalia died, actually, by way of total diversion, on our way to El Paso, dodging the American Border Patrol and trying to get to LA. It was actually the end of a very long patrons trip that we'd organized with this group, which is something we do every year. We've been together to Brazil, to Dubai, to Istanbul, to the islands in the Satuchi Inland Sea in Japan. And these are some of the most prominent art collectors in China. You'll see them on your booths if you're dealers walking
One
around.
would hope.
Yeah. And so then the question is, so what are they doing supporting a museum in a factory in Beijing that has the name of a Belgian baron on it? And that was very much started as what we're seeing quite a lot of in China today, a private art museum. Which is a topic people love to talk about. And I think the first thing that we need to talk about when we talk about private art museums is that when they're good, they're actually public, or they're working in the public spirit. And then the second thing in China is that they do that because the public art museums in China are actually not really in the public interest, they're in the party interest. And that, with a few notable and brilliant exceptions, especially the Power Station of Art in Shanghai, museum practice in China since 1949 has much more been about another vehicle for the promulgation of ideological perspectives rather than maybe work or artist-driven research into things. And so what you're seeing in Shanghai now with all of these single funder private museums happens because there's actually, I think, a recognition from a very high level in the government that this is a void that is most adequately, interestingly, and risk-aversely filled by private individuals who, in those contexts, are actually slightly incentivized by the government, but that's a different story. UCCA was weirdly the wind-breaking kind of pioneer of this model and done, yes, certainly as a testament to Mr. Ulin's great acumen as a collector at a certain moment, but also from the very beginning with a kind of Promethean idea of bringing the flame of a let's call it an international museum model to a context where in 2007 when we opened in this sort of district of factories that were abandoned where you were starting to have a few galleries but still very little foot traffic was a completely crazy idea, like almost as crazy as Donald Judd deciding to build a museum 3 hours from any airport. This 10 years has been quite long for China and for the world, but in that time we've seen this incredible evolution, and that's been one. I came 5 years into the story, so I'm the longest serving director in the history of UCCA, and in 2011, late 2011, and together with my CEO, we have a very similar arrangement to yours and Hans Ulrich's at the Serpentine. We decided immediately that it was time to just expand the base radically. So like all private museums, it really began as a single funder situation and then needs to sort of work its way to another place. And we very quickly, even in our first year together, she had been previously running the retail program, which is another always great source of funds. And in our case...
you have an enormous shop that
we
attracts
do,
a visitor
yeah.
who might not otherwise come. How does that fit into your ecosystem?
We love it. It's been responsible for different levels, different slices of the pie chart in different years, and it's actually declined as a relative percentage, but expanded as an overall percentage of funds raised. We have about an $8 million budget a year, and we pay $1 million of that is rent. That we pay to our friends in the Chinese government who own the factory. We get zero from the state, which we wouldn't want because it would invite a level of participation that we feel, would compromise us in ways that we're not already compromised by virtue of simply being there. So to introduce a group like this, which I think to go back to what everyone was saying about fundraising, on a good day, it's actually an outgrowth of the education program because we're probably deepening or broadening, choose your spatial metaphor, the horizons or reserves of these collectors and the kind of art they find they're comfortable knowing and thinking about.
That's a great question, because so often one is asked, what do you do for education? And you think, well, everything we do is in that sphere. How many people come through a year?
We're at about 1 million a year. In a typical year, we would have an exhibition program of about 12 exhibitions and somewhere in the neighborhood of 350 public programs, so averaging one a day, but clustered mostly on weekends. And then with sort of these parallel operations, four exhibition spaces, and then parallel operations in retail, which again, on a good day, we also think of as part of the program because it's actually a platform to promote Chinese design. And sort of innovation, and to engage with a whole other sphere that's kind of outside our exhibition purview. And then actually a kids center, UCCA Studio, which is doing creativity-driven educational programs for 2 to 11-year-olds that attract families, which is great because the parents come and see the shows and sometimes work for big companies and get interested in sponsoring us. But also, it fills a real need because there are plenty of sort of drawing and painting classes that teach you how to paint those flowers realistically, but there's just not a lot in the educational system in Beijing that thinks about the whole child and that promotes creative thinking. So that's conceived as a for-profit initiative, actually, but actually completely in keeping with the larger mission of the institution, which is to promote an inclusive cosmopolitan vision of China and the world through catalyzing contemporary art and culture. It's just briefly, just two other things that have been really good for us. I think I have so this is just an example of corporate sponsorship done well, which I think are things you were talking about earlier. This is an exhibition we made a few years ago with the artist William Kentridge, a deeply known and loved around the world. He's actually there in conversation with a young Colombian artist by the name of Mateo Lopez, who's also an incredible artist. They are actually Rolex Mentor Protege partners. So Rolex has an incredible initiative called the Mentor Protege Arts Initiative, which pairs people across various fields in these kinds of relationships. When I'd always wanted to do an exhibition with Kentridge, and Rolex came forward extremely generously to support with this exhibition, and the one kind of condition was to put William and Mateo in conversation, which was not much of a condition because what a great thing to be able to do regardless. So sometimes, I think we think a lot now about, I think there's definitely actually a trend towards corporations, enterprises asking for sort of bespoke programming that maybe is or is not in the mission or vision of the institution. And I think this can lead us in some very curious directions sometimes, but at other times, it still works well. And then the other thing is an event that we've kind of pioneered in Beijing.
What kind of resource does this bring into the institution in terms of your overall annual budget?
As people are laughing, right?
Leong had some numbers for me, so I'm looking for some numbers, Phil.
No, we were in fact able to. So pie chart wise, this dinner in 2016 actually grossed about 1.7 US. And 1.2 the year before. Patronage is just south of 1.
What is your annual budget?
On 8. So
on
this
8.
ends up being, and the thing about the gala, we produced it really, I think inspired by LA Mocha originally, the idea of taking an artist and putting them in charge and kind of creating an artistic immersive scenario. Well, you do something I think quite innovative with the Chinati Art Weekend every year and at other times as well. But this kind of large-scale event, there aren't that many. Hong Kong, there's a gala season that I think people very quickly get fatigued of in Beijing.
But I think it's interesting, the reliance in Hong Kong of that gala season. If there's a typhoon, if it's a bad day, when we look at Parasite and we realize that the annual gala so often is 60, 70% of your annual donor funding, I think it just also stresses the need for diversification. So it's interesting to look at this in a portfolio of activities, realizing one must do everything well all the time in order to sustainably fund this space.
Pretty much, yeah. Yeah. And it's interesting because, of course, there's this lingering question about, we create a lot of value actually by doing art exhibitions that we don't realize, that doesn't belong to us, because when we give an artist a show, their work sells for more and there's more interest in it, especially in a new market full of smart, curious collectors who didn't know who William Kentridge was before, who didn't know who Donald Judd was before we went to MARF. I mean, some of them did, but, and how do you? I mean, I think it requires a really complex understanding of value because and of what of that you can monetarily harness and what you have to let fly. In order to keep creating it, because in a way that's who you are as an institution. It's work that's being done, but at a charity auction, that's kind of the time to call in the favors and bring the objects back from the people in your orbit and pass them along, for hopefully massive sums.
Well, it's interesting, just also on that note, in terms of thinking competition. So what is the competition for resources? And so often when we think about the exhibitions that do benefit the artists, of course we're trying to think of what commercial galleries can't do so that we are advancing an artist's voice in a non-commercial way. So often these gallerists are asked so often to fund exhibitions all over the world. So
and it's not really their problem.
It becomes cannibalizing, absolutely. Competitive forces can be other great ideas, other great museums, but in your universe, is there also competition with the private institutions themselves? How do you work alongside some of these amazing private museums that we'll be seeing in Shanghai with our patrons group as we spend the next 3 days there?
I think private museums kind of need to go through a window of kind of proving themselves under the tutelage of the founder or group of founders. Once there's proof of concept that the mission and the program are interesting, then they get to start branching out and sort of soliciting resources. And I think people in China especially have very open attitudes about like no one's actually in it yet for the tax deduction or for some sort of, neo-Protestant sense of...
Do you think they're in Marfa for the tax deduction, Jenny? How do we counter that? So often one says, in America, there's a 501c3, and God, it's so tough in Britain because we are just not in the same environment as those very, very fortunate Americans. How do you counter that?
I think it's a real incentive, but it also, it kind of leads you back to the community and who your community is. I mean, for us, we don't if you think about MoMA, there are people in New York who are giving to MoMA or the Whitney because that's their community museum, and there's wealth there. They are proudly involved in their community institution, and they certainly get a tax break, but they're doing it because they believe in that. We don't have a community like that. In fact, our responsibility, I think, is very much back to the community because of what has developed in Marfa since Judd established Chinati. I mean, the world is coming through. Thinking about numbers.
It's actually blue. It's not red. It's this weird enclave of liberal America in the middle of the desert.
We're this very, bubble in a very red state. But I think our responsibility there is back to the community because of the changes. Gentrification is a real problem in Marfa. Our teachers can't afford housing because the world is coming through there. Somebody comes in on a Friday, they fall in love with the art on Saturday, and they're buying a second or third home on a Sunday. But we are very fortunate that we have a world now because, for Phil, thank you, with several of the people that came on that trip are now supporters of Chinati because they thought this is an incredible place and it needs to be supported. And so I think for us, our community is the world community, and there's no tax break in that situation for them. I think we're a bit of an anomaly because people are funding us and supporting us because we aren't like anything else. But because we aren't like anything else, we can't rely on more typical sources of support. You would have asked me earlier about Kickstarter. We were approached to consider a very small. Our goal for the Kickstarter campaign for the Robert Irwin project was $100,000. That's a lot for a Kickstarter campaign. And Kentridge came out at the same time to do a Kickstarter campaign. I think Kickstarter was interested in supporting artists and thinking this is a successful fundraising model, so let's try and make that successful for artistic projects that have real integrity. So of a $5 million budget, $100,000 was raised through Kickstarter. What was fascinating for us is Chinati, just in the couple of minutes that I tried to describe what it is, Contemporary Art Museum, founded by the artist Donald Judd in Marfa, Texas, 3 hours from, it's a complicated place. It's an evocative place, and I think it's an inspiring place, but you get like a 1.5 minute video to compel people to give you money. So we tried to pack in a lot of great images. Moving images all work to our advantage because they're inspiring. It was incredible to us that 577 people gave us money. I would say 560 of those had never been to Marfa, might not ever come to Marfa. Maybe realizing or learning about Robert Irwin was a new experience for them, but that $5 was so important for them, and they felt so good giving it. And for us, what an incredible validation isn't the right word, but just going back to the value of art that isn't about the monetary value. It gives people meaning, and it gives them an inspiration. And so it was incredible for us to be able to communicate in a minute and a half something that inspired 577 people to give us money, many of whom have never given to us or maybe even the arts before.
I think that's a beautiful statement about the power of the idea and the empowerment. I woke up this morning to my son's school WhatsApp group, and one of the parents had written, now do they really have to do art homework? Because they do so much math, they do so much science, and is it really important to do the art? And I just thought, 6 a.m. in the morning in Hong Kong, Shakespeare said art gives shape to life. And in that sense, it's so empowering, the power of a good idea.
I'm fascinated. What's art homework? I'm so fascinated. Like, do you have to paint a picture? Like, I'm thinking, well, that's an interesting concept. That's probably a panel discussion in and of itself.
I wanted to, it's conceptual, don't worry.
Okay.
They can do it in their spare time without you even knowing about it.
Right.
On that note, is it a good time to open up for questions, Vita? I'm sure there's so many in this group after such insightful words. I'd love to share my microphone with somebody.
Or we've answered everyone's questions. Oh.
Hi, thank you to the three of you. That was really interesting. What I'm particularly interested in is how the three of you are each thinking about specifically younger audiences, because particularly two of the organizations we've been speaking about have been open, for a couple of decades. I think, particularly being a young guy, in my 20s right now, I'm starting to travel the world, and I've got peers around the world who are now starting to maybe make enough money that they can actually give. But when I'm speaking to them about creative projects, it's still almost like I'm speaking to them in another language. They will go out and spend $500, on a table at a nightclub or whatever, or go and buy a new Gucci handbag for their girlfriend. But when you ask for them for a bit of money for an art project, that's something that I think is really important, because at the end of the day, younger people are going to be the future contributors to all of these organizations. So how are the three of you thinking about young audiences?
I think Yana actually is the person to answer that. You have the most successful, the future contemporaries, right?
I'm so blessed when I came in to the Serpentine and realized I only have 24 hours a day, although my brilliant artistic director, Hans-Ulrich Obrist, definitely has 48. I thought in terms of a strategy, the best to focus on is, of course, our council of 50 donors who are incredibly committed, who I am on the road with here for a week, showing them the best of Hong Kong and the region. And then the 100 kids who are under 30, under 40, future contemporaries, who have such incredible energy and who really give us the kind of spirit and ingenuity that we need. And so I think for us at the Serpentine, that's an incredible source of ideas around technology. For example, right now, we're obsessed with innovation. The Google VR that we have at Artistry has enabled Zaha's architects to go further than they can do before. And from our experience, the technology companies are not throwing money at you, but they're saying, what solution do you need? So you better have some great ideas in terms of your artists, but I also need some good problems. And we're finding with our younger donors, we'll spend time with them, we'll cultivate them, but we'll really give them the kinds of challenges that we think sometimes $500 or $1,000 that they do still want to spend at the club on the Gucci handbag won't solve. But maybe once they're in that club with their Gucci handbag, they can think through a partner proposal at a much bigger level. So I think don't ignore your young donors, but also don't look at the limitations, because what they can do, what the kids of the donors can do in terms of opening you up to new horizons, I think hang in there, and you can always join Parasite Art Space as a friend.
Well, at the Jockey Club, our experience is probably not that relevant, to be honest, to your question. When we think about youth from the trust perspective, it's normally thinking about talent development or audience build-up. For young professional, sort of the potential donors, we mostly think through horse racing. So if they come and horse race, the money eventually channeled to charity. So.
And we're actually going to spend the evening there tonight, so I'm hoping that it's good for Chinati too. Yes, exactly.
Successfully converted one.
Yes, exactly. I think also education. I mean, it goes back to, you know, where we ascribe value. And I think that teaching people at any age, but certainly young people, that art has value, and that comes through education. And then it goes back to, how do these institutions survive? I mean, for us, the fact that we're even having a conversation that we're going to cut the NEA means that we've decided as a government and as a people that it doesn't have value in our society. And you see it happen in public schools in the United States, where the first thing they cut is arts, because it's superfluous and it's, you know, an after-school program. It should only just be an after-school program. I think having candid conversations about the cost of things that are important in our society. And, you know, for us, Chinati's gone through such an interesting evolution of depending on kind of patrons from Heiner and Philippa and Dia, and then opening it as a public institution, and then doing traditional things like establishing a board of trustees, having people out there as an advocate for you, writing grants, trying to get government money. People often ask us, well, we'd like to give to Chinati, but what are your naming opportunities? My response is, Donald Judd didn't even name the museum after himself. So I hope that it's a larger recognition of valuable things that don't only have to be given in recognition, but as part of the greater good of culture. But that's, you know, that's a very personal conversation. That can also be a very sensitive conversation. You know, people who have resources should be allowed to do exactly what they want with it. But I think it's our responsibility to go out and offer them the opportunity to be part of something that is good for all of us. And sometimes you can feel like you're, you know, on your soapbox, like it's very important, but I think it goes back to education, giving people a good time. You know, we were joking about coming in, like a lot happens on a dance floor, especially for me in Hong Kong, you know, like going out and being on the dance floor. You meet great people on the dance floor because they're on the dance floor. They're participating in the dance. And sometimes you can have
Social sculpture.
Yeah, you know, I think while it is very serious and significant, it doesn't always have to be overly serious, and it shouldn't be a burden, I think.
My goal in life is to retire to Marfa and open a wine bar called the Chianti Foundation.
Funded by the Jockey Club.
Well, okay, and talking about fundraising, we were at a very well-respected older funders' home. I won't call them out, in a very esteemed city in the United States. And after 20 minutes giving the pitch on the Irwin project, this gentleman leaned over and said, I didn't know they made Chianti in Marfa, Texas. And his wife just leaned over and said, don't correct him, it works to your advantage. So, I mean, he might think that he's given to a vineyard in Marfa, but he helped with the Irwin project, so it's all good in the end.
Is there a final question that I can pose to our speakers? Natalie?
I'm just curious if anybody has an opinion on what happened at the Met, because they have the Met Gala. They had Ex Machina, the largest attended event last year in terms of visitors. They had the McQueen show, and you would think they'd be a brand magnet. What do you think happened there with the brand itself, the Met, and the money that was supposed to come in from the Lauder Foundation, and why did that happen? I mean, how do people avoid those types of debacles, if you will? I mean, maybe that's too tough a question, but
I don't think the Met is collapsing, and and I have to say, for Thomas Campbell, he has done extraordinary things there. I think the elephant in the room, I feel like, in that was also the fact that when all of this was happening, the admission that most people thought they needed to pay, which is $25. The state of New York, there was a lawsuit that said, no, actually they get a lease because it's a voluntary contribution for admission. I think most people going to the Met thought the ticket price was $25. It's actually pay what you wish. So that happened in the midst of a lot of other things in an institution. And it's funny that in all these articles, that hasn't. I mean, 25. How many people
Well,
go through
here's
the
the
Met?
flip side of that. They get 8% of their funding from the city, and they collect on average $6 per visitor. So the government, the city government requirement is not of a piece with what they get back. If they charge regular admission, they would have I mean, so it's there's a lot of ways, and then there's lots of ways to think about this, but.
But I
Yeah,
want to
but
celebrate the positive, and looking at Apple's partnership of the Met Ball, for example, I think it's very interesting to look at corporate partnerships that do work if we're going to be positive, and to look at the fact that although, of course, there are sometimes debacles and there's sometimes sidelines, there's also the kinds of partnerships that really thoughtfully channel so much incredible resource into the arts.
Sorry. It's super complicated.
Yeah, I mean, and
I don't
who
think
knows
it's
what
that
the
bad.
internal? I don't think it's that. I mean, I don't think any of us would want our institutions to have a headline in the New York Times that says our institution is in serious decline. It's one of the great institutions in the world, and I think we've all gone through situations where you have challenges. But
What I'm curious about is, do you think they had to adopt contemporary programming in order to stay current? I mean, how do you sort of balance the likes and the internet and what drives a project like a Rain Room that sells millions of tickets versus, antiquities? Like, it's really difficult. It's such a competitive market in New York and in the world with so much programming and so many brands. I just sort of wonder how you guys would have spun that around.
well, I think what Yana said, you make great programs. I think if you're giving people a great art experience, I think that the value of that is what then inspires people to give. I don't think they were making exhibitions there either that was about a certain level of popularity. I mean, we all can talk about what a blockbuster exhibition is, and who's driving the name of a blockbuster exhibition. But I think, popular exhibitions also, just because they're popular doesn't mean they weren't good exhibitions. I think it goes a couple different.
And I think the people on the panel have such amazing integrity in terms of the way that you align your projects with your funders, with your donors, the kind of effort that goes in. There's no such thing as passive philanthropy, because we know that philanthropists and partners have such a choice. So as I see Vita here giving me the wink, that Natalie's question demands a Swire Talk in itself at the 11th Art Basel edition, what I'd love to do is say a tremendous thank you to our audience, a tremendous thank you to our speakers, and a great thank you to Swire, and to all of you who are patrons of arts institutions who enable free thinking and free art for all. Thank you so much. Enjoy the fair.